Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to CLI students and members of the Melikian Center community. We're very privileged today to have with us Ambassador Michael Polt. So he's going to be talking for about 25 minutes and then we'll open it up to questions with first priority going to our CLI students. But if we have time, we're happy to take others' questions as well. So I wanted to introduce you to our guest today, Ambassador Michael Polt, who is Ambassador in Residence and Professor of Practice at ASU's School of Politics and Global Studies. And before assuming this position, quite recently in the fall of 2020, he spent 8 years as the Senior Director of ASU's McCain Institute for International Leadership. Prior to coming on board at ASU in 2012, Ambassador Polt had a 35-year career as a diplomat. Early on in his career, he was assigned to embassies in Bonn, Mexico City, and Copenhagen, as well as the U.S. consulate in Bremen, Germany. The ambassador held assignments as U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Estonia from 2009 to 2012, and to Serbia and Montenegro from 2004 to 2006, and then also the successor state of Serbia from 2006 to 2007. Prior to his ambassadorial missions, Ambassador Polt was Principal Deputy and Acting Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs in both the Powell and the Clinton State Departments. The ambassador has been the repeated recipient of the Presidential Meritorious Service Award and numerous Department of State Meritorious and Superior Honor Awards for outstanding policy leadership, management, crisis performance, and political analysis, and has been awarded the Thomas Jefferson Award for service to U.S. citizens overseas by American citizens abroad. Ambassador Polt was born in Austria, and he holds a BA from the American International College in Massachusetts and an MA in Public Administration from the University of Tennessee. And just to let everyone know that this is, I cut a lot of things out of that biography. I wanted Ambassador Polt to have something to share with you as well. So thank you again so much for agreeing to join us this afternoon, and I turn it over to you, Ambassador Polt.
Thank you very much, Irina, and thank all of you from the Melikian Center and the Critical Language Institute for allowing me to share some thoughts with you today. So let me give you an option before I start, because my mandate was to talk to you about various career paths in the U.S. Foreign Service today. And I can do that one of two ways or a combination thereof, depending on what you prefer. One is to talk about the U.S. diplomacy and the U.S. diplomatic service in the context of U.S. diplomacy as an instrument of national power, and to talk to you about the elements of that national power in its various elements. And the other is to talk to you much more technically about the various career paths in the Foreign Service, such as the various functional elements of how our diplomats, where our diplomats function, and how one applies and succeeds in the Foreign Service, or a combination of the two. Which do you prefer? Anyone speak up, or Irina speak for the group? Any one of you?
I thought I would take a more democratic approach and ask people to vote in the chat.
I see here three.
Yeah, so a lot of a big consensus for a combination of the two. That was three. That was option three. If that's how I meant it, I think that's how people took it. Yeah.
You all are as brilliant as I knew you would be. So, because I think that's the best way to do this. Let me first talk about the substantive elements of how U.S. diplomacy is exercised and the people in it, how they function in our diplomatic service, and then talk to you about some of the detailed elements of the various career paths in the service. I always start this kind of a presentation with, it is not the State Department's Foreign Service, it is not the State Department, the Secretary of State's diplomats, it is the President's foreign policy that the State Department executes and that U.S. diplomats pursue. It is the President's foreign policy. All U.S. diplomats are nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. All U.S. ambassadors are the President's personal representatives to the countries or to the organizations to which they're assigned, not the Secretary of State's. Now, in terms of bureaucratic process, of course, our diplomats report through a reporting chain through the State Department and ultimately to the Secretary of State, but ultimately really to the White House and to the President. So just so that we get clear, all of our diplomats function and support and represent the President's foreign policy. In the context of all the players of US foreign policy, the State Department likes to think of itself as the first among equals. Now you can say, that's great for the State Department, what about all the others? Well, all the others also have a word to say, whether it's the National Security Council, whether it's DOD, whether it's Homeland Security, whether it's US Treasury, whether it's the US Commerce or the Agriculture Department, whether it is the intelligence community. There are a lot of players in the US foreign policy circuit, but the State Department thinks of itself, sees itself, and if it plays its cards right, is definitely the first among equals in that overall cauldron of US foreign policy developers and implementers. A lot of the State Department's influence in US foreign policy development and execution depends on the relationship between the Secretary and the President. Obviously, the President nominates the Secretary of State, but then there is a chemistry or a personal dynamic that plays an important role. Most of you are too young to recall or to think a lot about the Kissinger and Nixon era, but that is such a cogent example of the difference between a Secretary of State who is in the position and the real foreign policy advisor, who in that case was Henry Kissinger, who was at first, until he switched to become secretary, the national security advisor to the President of the United States. So it is the dynamic between, the personal dynamic between the Secretary of State and the President that gives him or her the relative influence in our foreign policy process. In the overall bureaucratic process or the overall interagency process in Washington, the State Department often is not the most skillful player. And you might want to ask yourself, well, why? I mean, you're all supposed to be such smart folks in the State Department, or at least you think you are. Why aren't you more skillful players? Why do you think that is? If I say to you what I just said, the State Department is not a terribly skillful player in the domestic interagency arena, why would you think that to be the case? Any one of you. Take a guess. You're being shy, and it's not because COVID is about to come to an end and you're thinking about other things than listening to me. So I'll give you the answer. It's the Foreign Service of the United States. The State Department's mission is focused on international affairs and outside the United States. The interagency process in Washington is all about domestic politics, domestic power relationships, and the interplay between domestic policy and foreign policy. The State Department is the one agency that sort of thinks really outside our borders all the time. Many of the other domestic agencies think about everything inside US borders. That's why they often tend to be better players in the interagency arena. So what are some of the functions that the State Department assumes, that our diplomats assume around the world? Well, number one, we are the first official face of America. So if it comes to building a reputation for our country, in addition to our military that also plays a role, but our military is only in some places. Our diplomacy is everywhere. The face that the State Department, that our diplomats put on our overseas presence is what builds America's reputation. Whether we are the good Americans, the ugly Americans, the stupid Americans, the smart Americans, the effective Americans, or the not so effective Americans, the State Department plays a critical role. Because despite the many elements of important national policy that's being made, diplomacy comes down to ground level, grassroots interaction among people. America's diplomats are people, and all the other people who live outside our borders are also people. And it's that interaction and that interplay that builds an American reputation that is very hard to dispel, no matter how rich we are, no matter how powerful we are. If we don't do a good job of convincing people that of winning hearts and minds, let's put it that way, then not many of the other issues play an important role. We are the bundlers of US global interests. I told you there's so many different players in the foreign policy arena, but the State Department is the one where everything is supposed to come together, where the intelligence community, where DOD, the military, where the domestic agencies that play from commerce to agriculture to homeland security, who have some international, of course, responsibilities, where all that's supposed to be bundled to have one US foreign policy and one US diplomatic mission and not 16 or 20. You should be skeptical and ask me, does that always work? It doesn't. I'm telling you how it's supposed to be and how we try to make it work. And often it does, but it does not always. The State Department is also an intelligence agency, but not a covert intelligence agency. The State Department is an overt information gatherer. We very openly go around the world saying, tell us about yourself. Why do you do things this way? How do you stand on renewable energy policy? Where are you on peace in the Middle East? How do you feel about global health issues? So we gather information constantly. We process that information, we analyze it, and we bring it back home for use in setting US policy and US policy reaction to international events. We are also the translators. We are the foreign whisperers, if you want to put it that way. In other words, all the people around the world who have something to say to us or about things that interest us, speak through their own cultural filter, in their own languages, with their own predisposed notions about how they see the world. And often just because they say so doesn't mean that we understand it. It is the role of America's diplomats to go ahead and be the translators to the rest of America. Well, this is what the Germans actually mean. This is what the French actually say. This is how China actually is. This is how India actually feels. That is also an important function of our diplomacy. We, of course, are also the voice of America, and it's not just a radio station. We are the voice of America in the sense that we articulate US policy on a daily basis. We talk to people in governments, we talk to people in the private industry, in private sector, we talk to people on the street, we talk to young, old, middle-aged people. If we are good at our job as American diplomats, we talk to the entire range of international players who need to hear from us and we want them to understand us. And even if they don't support us, we at least want them to appreciate where we come from in terms of our positions. And we also are, like so many police cars you see around the country, we protect and defend, and we protect and serve as one of our primary functions. If you ask an American diplomat who knows her job well, she will tell you, and you ask her, what's your most important function? You've been assigned to country X. What's your most important function? To protect American citizens. So whether you're a tourist in country X, or whether you're a business woman or man in country Y, or whether you are a policy activist who just comes to speak about a policy position, any American is the business of the State Department to make sure that they are treated fairly, that they receive the services that the US government can offer overseas. And if all else fails and we don't do anything else, that's the one function that we cannot fail in, and that is protecting American citizens. We're also the leaders of US soft power. and you've heard that term many times used before, and that is what Harry Truman called, speak softly and carry a big stick. We are the soft power and the stick is behind us. And we use, if we do it right, we use those two elements. Soft power always up front, intelligent discourse always up front, diplomacy always up front, but always with the realization that we are a powerful nation with considerable resources, not just military, but economic, cultural, social, across the spectrum of national power. We represent that totality of US government capabilities. We are also the multipliers of US assets. In other words, we go ahead and goes back to what I said about being the bundlers of US interests. We know how to go ahead and bring other players to the field to help us achieve US policy goals. So if we just had a conversation a few minutes ago about Afghanistan and our pullout from Afghanistan. So if we're going to talk about, well, what's the future of US interest in Afghanistan, in addition to making sure that it cannot be used as a platform for terrorists to strike our homeland again. In addition to that, what's our role? Well, we want to keep the Afghanistan people safe and free, and Afghanistan girls and women able to have their full role in society. And we do that by bringing people to play who can help them do that, whether it's American educators, whether it's American agricultural experts for their economy, whether it is American news journalists to help them build up their independent press, whatever the case may be. We, the State Department, we, our diplomats, are the multipliers of the many assets the US has in both the public and the private sector. We are also the folks who pick up the pieces when everything else fails. When we fail, and let's say US interests are so deeply involved that US military force has to be used, long after we have won whatever kinetic action we have taken, whether it's in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in Haiti or in any of the conflicts, whether it was Vietnam, whether it was Korea, you name it, or World War II. At the end of all that, somebody has to pick up the pieces and remend the relationships. That's our diplomacy. So first we fail, the military comes and bails us out and never lets us forget it, and we come back in to make sure that the relationships can actually be reestablished. I'm being a little bit flip here. I don't mean to be, but just to give you a little bit something to energize you so you can challenge me when it comes to questions and answers, which we're going to be doing very shortly. And maybe the last thing I will say on this issue before I go to the technical part of your choice. Your diplomacy, your country's diplomacy gives you a great bang for the buck. And here comes my question, which I will not let you get away with not answering. What percentage of the US federal budget is dedicated to all of our diplomacy and all of our international development aid that we give around the world? What percentage would you say is dedicated to all our embassies, all our diplomats, and all the foreign assistance we give to every country around the world? What percentage? 5% I see, 15% I see, less than 2, 10, 5, under 1. Okay, you guys are pretty good. Well, let's put it this way. Those of you who said 15, no. It is just barely above 1%. So in terms of bang for the buck, okay, if you closed every US embassy and fired every US diplomat and gave not a penny of your hard-earned tax dollars to any country in the world ever again, we would save 1% of the US federal budget. Seems to me, I would suggest to you, your diplomats are giving you fairly good value for what you're paying for. We have a standing joke in the Foreign Service that says that there are more members of U.S. military bands than that there are U.S. diplomats. That's almost true. Not quite, but almost. There are certainly at least as many members of U.S. military bands as there are U.S. diplomats. That's not a great number of people to represent you in every country in the world, bar a couple. So let's talk about the State Department and its careers. Many Foreign Service officers consider their career almost like a priesthood, like a sisterhood, like a brotherhood, like a special cabal of people who see this not just as a job, but as almost like a vocation. That was probably more the case when I joined the Foreign Service in 1977 than it is now. I think my modern colleagues probably are a little bit more progressive in their thinking about career choices than my generation was. But nevertheless, there's still a certain amount of uniqueness to diplomacy and a diplomatic function that your Foreign Service officers think of themselves as being an unusual special subset of the federal civil service. That's why we are not civil servants, we are Foreign Service officers under a separate legislation, a different career ladder, and a different system of promotion, which is very similar to the military. We have a principle called up or out, which is patterned actually after the US Navy Officer Corps. And that is, in the Foreign Service, you have so much time to get promoted from the junior ranks to the mid ranks to the senior ranks to the top ranks. At various stages of your career, if you don't pass through that gateway, you get retired and are told, thank you very much for your interest in foreign affairs, but go do something else. So it makes for a very competitive environment in that sense. And we function while we actually have a very broad mandate of doing virtually everything that has to do with US foreign interests, there are 5 specific sort of columns, which the Foreign Service calls cones, which define the work of a Foreign Service officer, of a diplomat. Political, economic, consular, public diplomacy, and management as the 5 main functions in the Foreign Service. Political officers, which I was one of, are basically the political analysts and the interlocutors with the political system of the country of assignment. Analyze, gather information, report, interact, cajole, negotiate on the political relationship. Economic officers, similar things on the economic side, adding to that also an analysis and understanding of the foreign country's economy, of their financial system, of trade opportunities for American businesses, of investment opportunities in America by foreign companies. So that's what economic diplomats do. Our consular folks, those are the ones at the spearhead of taking care of our American citizens. Take care of our American citizens just to make sure that they're safe. If they've done something to land them in foreign jails, we go visit them. We make sure they get due process and a fair treatment. My first function in the Foreign Service for one of my brief rotational assignments in the embassy in Mexico City was I was death and estates officer, a pretty gruesome task. We also take care of, if an American passes away in a foreign country, we are the ones who help the family return the remains of their loved ones back to the United States for a proper burial and of settling the affairs of the individual who passed away. And of course, we also are the people who issue the visas to allow other people to come to America or not, depending on the decision that our consular officers make. Public diplomacy is basically the State Department's public affairs function. We call it public diplomacy now because back in the olden days, public diplomacy was a contradiction in terms. By definition, you didn't used to do diplomacy in public. Diplomacy is supposed to be behind closed doors. Well, that still happens, but we now do a lot more out in the open, with the media, with the press, literally at street corners, in order for us to deal with a wider cross-section of stakeholders in foreign countries than just governments. So public diplomacy now defines a much broader range of interaction between our diplomats and the people of the country where we serve. And the management function in the Foreign Service is basically the people who take care of our diplomatic platforms. They're the ones who buy, rent buildings, cars, keep the lights on, make sure that our diplomats have housing, that we have a logistics change for supplies for the embassy. They are the ones who help us if we have to, God forbid, evacuate from a foreign country. They're the ones who evacuate us from a foreign country. They're the ones who, if you catch COVID and you're in Colombia, they're the ones who find a way to bring you back home to get treated so that you do not die. So that's basically our housekeeping function, very, very critical to our function. So I'm reaching the limit of what Irina allowed me to go ahead and speak about before I turn it over to you. But one more quick element about entry into Foreign Service. Foreign Service exam is given multiple times a year, sometimes once a year, sometimes twice a year, sometimes 3 times a year, depending on the amount of intake that's necessary in the Foreign Service. It is a written exam followed by an oral examination. Whenever people ask me, well, so what should I study? What do I need to know to pass these 2 exams? And it's a very difficult thing to answer because the written exam lasts about roughly 5 hours, and it covers everything, which makes it very hard to study for because how do you study everything? What I mean by that, again, not to be too flip, it covers a very wide, it seeks to check on how much do you know about the world and the globe around you. From politics to literature to geography to economics to basic social issues across the board. Basically, how aware are you about the world in which you live? And it covers that to a considerable degree of detail. And then the written exam, if you pass the oral exam, if you pass that written exam, is the one to say, so how do you apply that now in a setting where in a group team setting, or when people question what you do and what your position is, where you actually go through some practice exercises of how you would actually perform your function. You are evaluated in a team building exercise. You are asked specific questions about policy issues and how you would approach certain international affairs challenges, and basically also how you express yourself and how you function in a somewhat high stress setting. And then you go on something called a rank register as to how you scored in the written and the oral examination, and you get a number as a total score. And then the Foreign Service goes down to, we need this year 500 new diplomats. And if your number is 499, you are good. If your number is 501, it's thank you very much, and you can start all over again. So that's roughly the intake process of our Foreign Service. So it is now 29 minutes. I was told 20 to 25 minutes, so I'm 4 minutes over. So I'll stop there, and I'd love to have a conversation with you now. So have at it. Hit me.
So as I said, this session is primarily for our CLI students. So we'll definitely take their questions first. If our other attendees have questions and we have time for them, we're happy to do that as well. But I did just want to give the CLI students who are here, we have students all the way from Albanian to Uzbek, the entire spectrum of CLI languages. So whatever questions you might have about the more kind of, the very interesting kind of lay of the land in terms of how the State Department functions and where its power comes from and what its sort of weak spots are in terms of exercising that, or any of the more kind of nitty-gritty specifics about careers in the Foreign Service. If you want to use the raise hand function, then we'll call on you as in the order that you raise hand, or if you want to prefer to raise your question in the chat, that would also be fine. I'm happy to read your question out loud. So yeah, CLI students, go get at it. I know you've asked many great questions in other events, so please, Jennifer.
Guten Abend, Ambassador from Germany.
Guten Abend, freut mich.
I just have a very practical application question. Is there an age limit? Because the Germans have age limits for everything, and I don't know how it is with the Foreign Service.
There's only one, Jennifer, there's only one age limit in the Foreign Service, and that is you have to be young enough to be able to complete one full tour of duty abroad before you mandatorily have to retire. And the mandatory retirement age for the US diplomatic service is 65.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So you have to, and the normal overseas tour is about 3 years. So you have to be able to start your overseas assignment at the age of 62 in order for you to be able to do 3 full years before you have to retire. Other than that, we have people joining like I did straight out of graduate school. I was 23 when I started. And we've had people start when they were in their 50s.
Okay.
So no, we do not have an age limit for joining, except for that one proviso which I just mentioned to you.
All right. Thank you very much. Dankeschön.
Bitte schön. Gern geschehen.
Great. We have a question in the chat from Bryn, who's one of our Russian students. And she asks, as a career diplomat, how do you reconcile possible political differences between what you believe and what you may be asked to do or promote by the president who is in office at the time?
That is a brilliant question, and I thank you for asking that question. That is a really, really important question for every US diplomat, for every diplomat, I think, in other countries as well. I have a very, and I think most of my colleagues would share that, a very firm opinion about the responsibility, the professional responsibility of a career diplomat. And that is, I began my comments to you today about it's the president's foreign policy, not Mike Polt's foreign policy. I can like it or not like it. I can agree with it or not agree with it. And I have choices. If I like it, it's easy. If I don't like it, but I can live with it, it's relatively easy. If I don't like it and I can't live with it, there's only one choice for me to do. Well, there are two choices. Well, there are three, and one of them is absolutely out of the question, okay? So I'll start with that one. The third one is go outside and tell the press how much you hate the president. Categorically, absolutely unacceptable. That is not professional behavior. It makes no difference what party the president is from. It makes no matter what gender he or she is. I don't care whether you like his or her suit or dress. If you're a professional, you support the president or you take one of the other two acceptable choices. One is, I mentioned Nixon and Kissinger beforehand. Back during the Vietnam era, there were lots of US diplomats who were very, very, very opposed to US Vietnam policy. And what they did was, in most cases, the responsible thing is they resigned. And that's the other responsible choice. In other words, if you are a diplomat and you are there to execute the president's foreign policy, but you cannot live with that policy, your responsibility is to resign. And if you are going to resign, then you regain all your rights as a citizen, and you can say whatever you want to say because you have First Amendment rights to speak your mind. But as a career diplomat, you follow the policy direction. But you do have one other option that Henry Kissinger instituted when he was Secretary of State, because he didn't want all these diplomats to resign in opposition to US Vietnam policy. He created something called the dissent channel. It is a very special method of communicating between any diplomat, no matter how junior or how senior, between an American diplomat and the Secretary of State, whoever she or he is, to say, dear sir, dear madam, I disagree with this policy, and here is the reason why. I ask you to consider a different policy direction. And the ambassador, who otherwise controls all communication coming out of an embassy into Washington, cannot stop that communication from happening. Every individual diplomat is allowed to send that message directly to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary has a policy staff that he or she assigns to give a considered response to that question. In my 35 years in the Foreign Service, I used that system one time. When I was in Panama, I disagreed with our policy in Panama, and I wrote a message saying, I disagree, and this is my reason why I think you're wrong, our policy is wrong, and I think you should have a different policy. I got a very polite answer back saying, thank you very much for your interest in foreign affairs, but we're going to go ahead and pursue our policy. And here is why. So I had my chance, and I chose, okay, I can live with that dissonance or that disagreement. Otherwise, I would have had to resign. Long answer to a short but very important question.
Okay, we've got some more student questions in the chat. This one's from Peter, and he asks, does the Foreign Service value regional expertise in applicants, diplomats, in terms of assignments, or are skills kind of understood to be universal?
Yes. In other words, it's like so much in the State Department. There's a yes and no answer at the same time. Yes, absolutely. Especially you all in the critical languages area of Melikian, where you gain such important skills. The State Department very much values regional, substantive, language, cultural expertise deeply, but it does not always honor that expertise, particularly in the early parts of a diplomat's career. The overall philosophy, certainly the philosophy I joined the Foreign Service with was, and Jennifer will appreciate this, I spoke native German, and my first assignment was Mexico City and language school to teach me Spanish. So the point here is like Irina is already referring to, and that is, we value diplomats who can function in any setting, no matter what the cultural setting is, no matter what the language is, because we do have facility to teach you both cultural, language, and everything else. But at the same time, if you're an Arabic speaker, if you're a Mandarin speaker, if you're a Russian speaker, if you speak any one of the other incredibly complex languages in the world, and you have expertise from that region, you will find a good part of your career in that region, where it's going to be used put to very good use. Actually, it may be put to such good use that sometimes when you want to break out of that and say, well, I'd like to actually serve, I know I speak German, but I kind of like to serve in Mexico City, they may not let you because they say, we would rather have you be in Munich or in Berlin. So that's the answer to that question.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from Sarah. She's one of our Persian students, Persian Farsi. And she's asking a kind of a more career path question. When applying as a Foreign Service officer, you apply to one specific cone in the Foreign Service. Are you locked into that for your service, or are you able to shift between or take smaller assignments within the other cones?
You're not locked in, and the department moves in, sways like a palm in the wind when there's a windstorm. Sometimes you're forced to go ahead and make a cone choice as you take the exam and you come in in a certain cone. And there have been periods in the history of the Foreign Service where officers come in as generalists, and then the cone is decided later on. So, but in either situation, you can switch. In my case, actually, I did. So the department doesn't make it very easy for you, but at the same time, they also know that if you are happier and more dedicated, or let's say more interested in a certain subject field, to let you switch and perform better in here than to force you to work over here where you don't want to be, you can do it. So the answer is yes, you can switch. Even if you came in as a political officer, but you really would prefer to be a public diplomacy officer, you can switch.
Okay, great. And it looks like, Stephen, did you have your hand up? Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, my question kind of went hand in hand, though. I was just going to ask, when it comes to the multiple functions of the Foreign Service, if you can list a preference or you get to pick, or do they usually assign you right off the bat?
You can list a preference. And sometimes there's a little bit of wiggle room for negotiation. Sometimes there's even a lot of wiggle room for negotiation, depending on what kind of skill they need in certain places and how you've built your professional network within the Foreign Service community. But ultimately speaking, we all take an oath, and we all sign an actual document that says, I am going to be available for worldwide assignment, which means you can send me like a military officer anywhere you want to. In the end result, we have something called, we sound so much like the military in some respects. We have something called travel orders. In the end result, no matter how long you've argued, no matter how much you would rather have gone to Beijing than to go to Berlin, in the end result, you will get your travel order that says, be on this plane and get yourself out there on this date. And that's where you're going.
Awesome, that makes sense. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, so we still have a good amount of time for questions. CLI students, feel free to ask more questions, but I'll open it up to our other participants. I know, Lee, that you wanted to ask a question, so if you'd still like to do so, please go ahead.
Yes, sir, please.
Are you talking to me there?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, please.
Okay, well, I wanted to ask a question about the people who do not pass the Foreign Service exam, which I know very, very small percentage of people pass it. It's one of the most exclusive exams there is in the world, like the Mandarin system or something. Can you get into the Foreign Service through other avenues?
The answer
For example, we find out that ambassadors are often just appointed because they're some crony of a powerful politician. And right now, there's many, many of the ambassadorships that are not filled. And so the people at the very top seem to be exceptions to the admission to the Foreign Service, if ambassadors are considered part of that. And I'd like to know what other avenues there are besides the Foreign Service exam to get into the Foreign Service.
It's an excellent question.
You know, that over the years, I taught for 50 years in the universities, and I was always recommending people take, my students, mostly students of Russian, take the Foreign Service exam. And I in all those years, I don't think I had 10 people who passed that Foreign Service exam. I don't mean to scare people, but it's a very exclusive exam.
Well, it's a great question. And thank you very much for your comment also and recounting your own experience with your students. I'll answer it in three ways. First one is, if somebody comes to me, and I've had many aspiring colleagues come and ask me this question: what if I don't pass the Foreign Service? I said, Foreign Service exam. I said, take it again. What if I don't pass it a second time? Take it again. What if I don't pass it a third time? Take it again. In other words, if the Foreign Service is your passion, keep taking the damn exam. But your question is very well put. There are other ways to serve in the State Department and in US diplomacy. The first one, stay in the Foreign Service. First of all, we bring in some specialists in the Foreign Service who do not go to the normal exam process. Two different types. One is professionals in certain fields that are not strictly diplomatic. In other words, we have a medical corps in the Foreign Service. Well, you got to be a nurse or a doctor. It's not a political science major is not going to become, the medical officer at Embassy Moscow. So we bring those people in by their skills. There's an evaluation process. There is a sort of an exam process, but it's a different one from the regular Foreign Service exam. We also bring in specific management functions that are underrepresented or are hard to come by. Computer specialists, human resource specialists that come from fields which are not naturally sort of thinking. You know, if I'm a computer whiz, my first thought is Apple, Google, Microsoft, etc. It's not the US government, because I'm going to do probably better, earn more money, do more exciting things, at least I think I am, if I go do that. So the Foreign Service provides incentives and opportunities for people whose function we need in the Foreign Service to support our overall effort, but do not fall into the traditional Foreign Service work in that regard. And finally, the Foreign Service also includes a great number, not the Foreign Service, the State Department also includes civil servants. In other words, we have inside the State Department, I'm looking here because I have that number, about 10,000 civil service team members. And they don't serve abroad. They serve here at the home office or in any of our regional centers, our passport offices around the United States. You're still involved in US diplomacy on the home front. You're still working on international affairs issues, and those you apply for like the regular civil service. Jobs are announced, you send in your qualifications are matched against the job requirements, and then you get hired or not hired, but there's no exam per se. So those are additional ways to come close into the Foreign Service. Now, and finally, you can sometimes come into the State Department as a civil servant and then convert to the Foreign Service after you have demonstrated your skill that would make you a good Foreign Service officer. And that will go, you still have to go through a certain sort of an application process, but it's not the formal Foreign Service exam. So that's my long answer to your very short and very important question.
Well, I really appreciate that first part of it, because I take it again and again because of the 10 to a dozen people I know over many years of encouraging people to take it. Most of those who went to work for the Foreign Service were taking it 2 or 3 times or even more. So persistence does pay, I know.
Took me twice. So absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
That's true for me on my driving exam. So, you know.
Me too.
More than twice, slightly more than twice.
Exactly. Just go for it.
Yeah. So, and then the other one, of course, is what Dr. Croft mentioned, which is to be a good pal of the sitting president, right?
Okay, now here's the thing.
So you're a career diplomat, so I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, first of all, even if you're a good pal of the president, you're not going to become a Foreign Service officer. You can become an ambassador, and ambassadors, even Foreign Service officers like I was, when I became ambassador, I actually left. I didn't leave the Foreign Service, but I was no longer part of the Foreign Service career track. I became a presidential appointee, even though I was a professional diplomat. So even if you're a good pal of the president, you can never become a Foreign Service officer. That the law does not allow, but you can become an ambassador. Now you say, well, that's ridiculous. Probably it is ridiculous.
It's strange. It's a quirk, definitely. I did not know that.
You know, back from the founding of the Republic, we've been doing this strange stuff, and it doesn't matter what party is in power, they all do it, and it all happens. Sometimes to excess, sometimes with a little bit more moderation. So there we are. Yes.
In the last 2 days, I surveyed the Wikipedia entry on our ambassadors, and I looked down the whole list to make a statement about how many of them are not. They're vacant positions and looking for cronies and so on. But over and over again, and I think if a person is made an ambassador, having been a Foreign Service officer, they definitely state that with pride, and quite a large number, I think the majority probably, that are sitting in ambassadorships did come from the FSO.
They do. The rough percentage, if you even it out over administrations from Washington to Biden, roughly the percentage we always use is 70-30. 70% of our ambassadors are career, and roughly 30% are what we call non-career. Sometimes that shifts a little bit in one direction or the other, but that's roughly where we stand.
Okay, great. So there's another question for you in the chat that knowing of the work that you're doing now at ASU, I feel like is going to be a perfect one to kind of end our discussion on. So it's two questions from Bern. What do you wish you had known about working at State before you joined? And on a different note, how do you foresee diplomacy and diplomatic work changing in the next decade or so?
Great questions. God, those are great questions. You guys are so smart. Okay, what do I wish I had known about the Foreign Service? I'm one of those. It's not actually that unusual in the Foreign Service. I am what's called a Foreign Service brat. My stepfather was a Foreign Service officer. So I had a fairly good sort of sense of what life in the Foreign Service was like by having moved with my family around as a teenager to different countries. So maybe if on the substantive side, what I wish I would have known more of, and I certainly wish I would have known more of, is that how deeply domestically grounded our foreign policy really is. Because I came in with this, I want to be a diplomat. I want to serve abroad. I want to go ahead and represent this country around the world. I wish I had known a little bit more about America and what motivates America, which has nothing to do in many cases with foreign affairs, in order to inform me to be able to do my job as a diplomat better. I learned that along the way. I think I know much more about that now than I did when I began. I wish I had known more before I started. I'm working on a couple of master classes right now in my new function at ASU as ambassador in residence. We're going to have about a dozen master classes that within a year we'll have them all running. And one of them is understanding America to represent America. I've been embarrassed at times overseas. Germany has been one of the places at times where we found that the foreign country to which we are guests as diplomats, know more about our history than we know about our history. And we need to do more, we need to do better than that. What's the future of diplomacy? Well, I am one of those diplomats who says, any of you who thought that in the 21st and 22nd and 23rd and 24th centuries, we'll just have a bunch of computers, a computer in each capital and artificial intelligence, and they will be talking to each other and we can save ourselves lots of money, that 1% we can save ourselves from the federal budget, and we don't have to have people talking to each other. That is the biggest bunch of bunk that I have ever heard. Diplomacy is a people business. People react to each other on a personal basis, no matter how sophisticated the policy, no matter how complex the issue, no matter how extensive the negotiation, people react to each other on a personal level. At times when I have failed as a diplomat, it's when I have failed to establish a personal connection with both my friends internationally and my adversaries internationally. And the times that I have succeeded, both with my friends and with my adversaries, is when I found a personal connection, even with people who violently disagreed with American policy, but nevertheless, they could talk to me and I could talk to them, and we would have some kind of a human interaction despite our policy differences. So I think the future of diplomacy is bright if we play our cards right, if we continue to provide assets to our diplomatic efforts around the world, and that we continue to remember that people relate to people, not machines to machines. That's my final answer on that issue.
Bravo.
Okay, thank you so much. Great. And comments from the chat. Interesting and informative presentation of an exciting career path at almost any age. Thank you, Ambassador Polt. And yeah, I just want to repeat our thanks from the Critical Languages Institute and the Melikian Center for speaking to us this afternoon. We know you have a very busy schedule. And again, I'd like to point out that this is kind of part one or the first of our State Department careers discussions. We continue tomorrow with our CLI alumni panel. So 3 CLI alumni from, from spanning from the 90s to 2019 who have all found their paths in the State Department coming to talk about that. So any other questions you have about the Foreign Service exam or these different cones, or just to get a perspective from other Foreign Service officers about how many times they had to take the exam, perhaps, if that's not too touchy a subject to ask people, they'll be with us tomorrow. But thank you so much again.
Absolutely. I'll add to that my goodbye. Thank you again for letting me be with you. And by all means, gather your input from many different sources. So listen to my colleagues, former colleagues. They may agree with some things I said, they may disagree, and all of it is valid, and you need to form your own opinion. So get a multiplicity of inputs to form your own path forward. And best of luck to you. And I hope you join the Sister and Brotherhood. And I know we're all looking forward to the master classes that are coming out of your work at ASU. So we'll be announcing the first set, about 3 or 4 of them this fall, and I hope that you're able to join. All right. Thank you so much again. Take care, everyone. It was wonderful to see you. Stay healthy out there. All the best.
Thanks a lot.
Take care. Bye-bye.